Hey, good morning, everybody. My name is Todd Beach. This is the AP Live for AP European History. Welcome today. I'm a teacher at Eastview High School in Apple Valley, Minnesota. That is a suburb of Minneapolis and St. Paul. Really excited you're with us today. And this is Katie.
Hi, good morning. I'm Katie Lancey. I teach at Coral Gables Senior High, a suburb of Miami, Florida. Welcome. We're really excited to continue the week with you guys. And let's go through and start the lesson and go over what we're going to cover today. So today, if you can see, is Tuesday. We're going to just highlight some stuff from the Reformation and the religious wars, as well as I want to focus you on Friday when we're going to give you that full DBQ practice along with feedback as we did this week on Monday. So really quickly, we are going to fly through some of the highlights of Luther and the Protestant Reformation, the spread beyond the German states, a little topics on the wars of religion, and then some information about the response to all this with the Catholic Reformation. And these are our learning objectives. If you would like to read through them, please feel free to pause the video. We're not going to read them to you, but we're going to move forward, but they're there for you if you want to go back and look at the different skills and processes that we're going to be hitting today.
Okay, thank you, Katie. Our warm-up today, this is what we left you with as practice yesterday. So we were focusing on sourcing because that's certainly going to be a part of DBQ that you're going to be writing for the exam. And we wanted to add a little bit to it as we were looking at your first full DBQs that many of you submitted. You're doing a very good job, but we want to look at, can we do a little better on some of the things within the sourcing? So one of the things that we looked at was attribution. That is, how do we cite evidence within text, do an in-text citation or attribution? It's not something that if you do it incorrectly on the rubric that you're not going to earn a point as long as you're sourcing correctly, but good writers make proper attribution of the source, and we're all working to be good writers. So in D, there in the red oval, we have a sample stem you could use is according to, or the author's statement issued, or the statement issued by, or use the author's name, shared his, her, their perspective as a way to kind of introduce the source, and that information comes from the source line. So the homework we gave you was to write a paragraph where you introduce the source using attribution, then explain the historical situation, audience purpose, or point of view of the document. So if you have yours, because you wrote those, we had, well over 100 of you submitting, and you're sharing notes and information with us. We so appreciate that. And we read all of it. So thank you so much. We gave you this source, document 10. It's from the 2000 AP European History exam. It's related a bit to what we were talking about yesterday with enclosure and commercial agriculture. So it's somewhat related to that, but we asked you to, can you give a proper attribution of this source and then source the document? And we know that we didn't give you a prompt or anything that this is from, but we're just kind of working in really much in the micro on this skill. So here's a response from Matthew at San Ramon Valley High School in California. And again, I encourage you to get yours out in front of you and kind of compare the samples we've shown with what you're doing so that you can kind of give your own reflective feedback about how you're doing. So that first line is the attribution I have in yellow. According to a Russian official's report on a village incident in the Novgorod province, that's attribution. That's what we're looking for, is how you introduce the source you're about to give, because the readers will know the source material. And when you cue them, here's where I'm going, they kind of sit up and they go, okay, here's where we're going to get some sourcing or description or some explanation. And then the blue, Matthew has written sourcing, point of view, and historical situation. And I really like, Matthew, that you just said right out there, here's point of view, the point of view of the woman. I think you were referring to the Russian official. I could be wrong. She could have picked the berries to feed herself or her family or sell them to make money due to the poor conditions the abolition of serfdom failed to resolve. So I think you're talking about her, but I think you're talking from the point of view of the Russian official. I could be wrong, but I kind of bracketed that because I wasn't sure. Tsar Alexander II's abolition forced the freed, in quotes, serfs to pay a debt to the government that was gone to reimburse the landlord's losses. So there you've given me the historical situation. You've done point of view. We've done the sourcing. We have attribution up here at the top. That's really well done. One thing that I've always liked as a reader is I liked when the student was done working with that document as a piece of evidence to just put the parenthetical Doc 10. That kind of cued to me, I've handled this piece of evidence and I'm moving forward. It isn't required by the rubric, but I think good writers kind of notice that we're going to begin with attribution. We're going to do the sourcing. We're going to then kind of cue the reader. I've finished with that document. Katie, do you want to say anything added to that before I move to the
No,
next
you
slide?
actually, I'm sitting here nodding while you're saying all of this. There's a combination of what we're looking to do here is starting with the attribution is really modeling good writing when you're using evidence. And then we also want to be practical that this essay is going to be read by someone who's counting how many documents you use, and the writer needs to count how many documents he or she uses. So that parenthetical at the end, while it's certainly not required, is just a really good best practice. And so I love what you did here. All of this helps keep straight how much evidence we're using, and use the evidence in a way that will also model good writing for evidence going forward. So I think that's really great.
Okay, thanks, Katie. And thank you, Matthew. You've provided a really nice sample for all of us to learn from. And again, if you don't have your sample in front of you, those who are listening, if you can, that will really help you to kind of reflect on what you wrote versus the samples we're showing. Here's the next sample. This is from Iris at Paul VI High School in New Jersey. And the attribution begins, in a report on an incident in a village in Russia, a Russian official explained. So again, we've just begun with that. Here's where I'm going. I'm cueing the reader. Here's my attribution line. Then in the blue, this is the sourcing, its purpose, and a nod to point of view. So I'll read it to you in the blue. The sole purpose, again, using that word, of this punishment was to humiliate her enough so that she would not want to break the rules again or complain against the offenders. The Russian official wrote this report to inform the people of the village about the purpose of the humiliating parade from the perspective of someone in authority in the village. So that's kind of a nod to point of view, who the Russian official is, someone in authority in the village. That's really well done, Iris. And then again, like we did with the last sample, I always liked it as a reader when a student would close out, when they're done handling that document in the writing, the parenthetical Doc 10. One more sample. This is from Mallory at Rolla High School in Missouri. Again, really well done with the attribution. This one's shorter, so it doesn't have to be super long. It's certainly going to earn the point for sourcing. Attribution, the report on an incident in a village in Novgorod province, Russia, is written by a Russian official. Okay. And then in the blue, we've got our sourcing here. I've just kind of highlighted two different areas. Purpose being to report what the offender did and how she was punished. This is important because, so I love that you did that, Mallory, because we've been saying do happy. That is, if I'm doing one of the acronyms, historical situation, audience, purpose, or point of view, you describe here first the purpose, and then you say, this is important because. I just love that it's just right out there, very explicit. This is important because it shows how important community is to village life for peasants in Europe. The community and their opinion has great repercussions on a peasant's life, which is shown by this report. Mallory, that's just awesome. And then again, we keep saying, a lot of you don't do this. I've seen some of you do this, but we're going to introduce this to you because I think it will help you as a writer, and it certainly helps us as readers. Add the document number to complete the citation, cue the reader, I'm done handling that document. Okay, it's so simple, and I think you'll really appreciate how it really helps your organization as you're working your way through the essay. Thank you guys so much for these responses. There were more that came in this morning, and I was glancing through those, and I was trying to give quick replies. We are reading them all, and you know we have a short amount of time, so the best thing to do is to make sure you have your response in front of you, look at it, compare it with the samples. Where are areas that you think, yes, I'm nailing that, and here's an area where I've got to do a little bit better job. You guys can do that part. Okay, so was this helpful? We're kind of introducing something new to you. We want a little bit of feedback because we're trying to tailor to what you need in these lessons. So on Twitter, we have a Twitter account now called @LearningEuro. And so we have some polls up there today. And the first poll is from these samples. So if you have time and can go there and just let us know, were these samples, this feedback helpful to your learning? That's the first poll for today. And so you can do that at @LearningEuro on Twitter, and we'd appreciate that kind of feedback.
All right, great, Todd. Thank you so much. Todd and I were joking this morning that we frequently spend a couple of weeks covering the content we're going to go through very quickly now. So we hope that we are activating knowledge that you already have. So a quick overview from A is that the Catholic Church is really the center of life as we move into the early 16th century. People of all social classes spend a great deal of their time and their money participating in religious activities. Every small town, every village would have a church as the center of its daily life. But the Catholic Church is being criticized. It's being criticized for things like absenteeism and pluralism. And these are ideas where people are holding offices that they're not actually visiting the territory, and they're holding multiple offices. And although they're criticized, it hasn't led at any point yet to dramatic change until we see and see Martin Luther. And there's his painting on the right there. And Martin Luther is an Augustinian monk. And by studying the New Testament, he comes to his central and core beliefs that salvation is achieved by faith alone. And he believes that the scriptures are important, that they reveal God to people, but that the traditions of the Catholic Church are not required. And so this is obviously very new feelings at this time. He's not the first person to criticize the church, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And at the same time, we have a new Pope, Pope Leo X, and he is authorizing a special indulgence. And an indulgence was a remittance of sin. The theology believed that you had to pay for your sins in purgatory, and this indulgence would be something that could be purchased that would release you from purgatory, or you could buy it on behalf of someone else. And in the German states, there was the sort of used car salesman of indulgences, Johann Tetzel. And these indulgences are being sold throughout the German territory with this little buzz phrase, "When a coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." So this was actually deeply troubling to Martin Luther. And Todd, if you'll go to the next slide, we have the sort of famous, painted well after, quintessential Reformation moment of Martin Luther, who's really upset, writing to the Archbishop of the German territory where these are being sold, and his 95 Theses. And these are his very iconic moment of walking up to the door of the church in Wittenberg and nailing this on the wall on October 31st, 1517. And because, and I know we spoke about some of this on Thursday, the widespread use of the printing press is going to allow this to be disseminated quickly throughout the German states. So this, as you can imagine, does not make Rome happy. Luther will continue to write. There's a variety of different events that I'm just sort of moving past. And it comes to a head when Rome threatens him with excommunication, or expelling him from the Catholic Church. And in 1521, the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, who's Charles V, and it's important to note that that is the geographical context of what we're talking about, is a confederation of different German states, all who have a prince that are in charge of them, who are beholden to the elected Holy Roman Emperor, who is Charles V at the time. So he calls a diet, or an assembly of the nobility and clergy, in the city of Worms. And he calls on Luther to appear and asks him to recant or take back what he said, and Luther refuses. So after the Diet of Worms, we're going to see continued religious division. We're going to see princes in the German states that will be Lutheran, some that will remain Catholic. And in 1530, Charles V is going to call yet another diet, an imperial diet in Augsburg, to stop the spread of Protestantism. Charles V is devoutly Catholic. And this is actually unsuccessful. And by 1555, he will have agreed to the Peace of Augsburg. This allows Protestantism, particularly Lutheranism, and I know Todd's going to get to some consequences of that here in a few minutes. And the German princes are able to decide whether they're Catholic or Lutheran in these individual states. He's also going to translate the Bible, which I'll speak to you in a minute in our activity. So this was a quick overview of the start of the Reformation. And then the Reformation is going to obviously spread away from Germany.
Thank you, Katie. One thing too is just, I'm always telling my students that, it's a history course. You don't have to remember every date, but there are some big dates in history that you have to know. And one is 1555, Peace of Augsburg. Because once you know some of these big dates, it kind of anchors you in a century, and you can figure out what's going on before that date. You can kind of figure out what's going on after that date. So Peace of Augsburg, 1555. And again, as Katie mentioned, these are just quick overviews because we should be layering on learning that took place earlier in the year for you. The spread of Protestant ideas, and we're going to ask this big question: how do Protestant ideas and institutions spread? And institutions spread beyond the German-speaking lands. We begin with the source on the right, and this is Henry VIII, the Tudor King of England. I'm sure that your teachers had fun talking about Henry VIII, and maybe you even learned the song about Henry VIII and his 6 wives. But it's going to cause quite the crisis in England, and we'll get to that in a minute. How do these ideas spread to other German-speaking lands and other lands that are beyond German-speaking lands? So we begin with Scandinavia. So the first area outside of Germany to officially accept the Reformation was the Kingdom of Denmark, Norway under King Christian III. And then while the process of conversion went smoothly in Denmark, it was initially resisted in Norway and Iceland, but it was gradually imposed after that initial resistance. In Sweden, Gustavus Vasa helps bring Protestantism to the region. These things then become kind of state religions in Scandinavia. And that's important to know because once the authority has accepted that as the faith, then it becomes kind of cemented in society. So that's kind of important to pay attention to. Then we get to Henry VIII and the English Reformation. So the Catholic Church, we talk about what was the church like in England before the Reformation. And historians begin with that. You have to begin with context. What was it like? The Catholic Church was healthy in England. The problems that Katie mentioned of absenteeism, clericalism, these other problems that Katie identified with the Catholic Church weren't happening so much in England. It was vigorous in the early 16th century. It's not to say there wasn't some corruption or bad things going on, but there was. For the most part, it's vigorous in the early 16th century England. There were less of a gap between clergy and educated lay people than elsewhere in Europe. So it begs the question, well, if Henry VIII did have the male heir he wanted, would the Catholic Church still remain in England today? But that's a what if of history. 1534, in order to legitimize his divorce and subsequent marriage to Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII will convince Parliament to approve the Act of Supremacy, making him the head of the English Church. So if you think about a pyramid with of the Catholic Church, that hierarchy, the social hierarchy of the Church, the Catholic Church, and the top of that pyramid is the Pope. What the Act of Supremacy did in England was to remove the Pope from the top of the hierarchy and place Henry VIII right up there at the top. He will then seize the monasteries throughout England, distribute their lands to the upper classes. And in 1536, there is popular opposition in the north due to all these religious changes. It leads to the Pilgrimage of Grace, which is a really soft-sounding name, but it ended up being a massive rebellion that Henry VIII had to try to put down. We'll continue talking about the spread of Protestant ideas and upholding Protestantism in England after Henry VIII. His daughter from Anne Boleyn is Elizabeth I, and she will help steer, it's in, I think, every textbook kind of uses the same language, steer the middle course between Catholicism and the Puritans who want a pure church free of Catholic influences. This is going to come with an attempt to try and reinstall Catholicism back in England. So Philip II of Spain will learn of a plot by Mary, Queen of Scots, who is the cousin and heir of Elizabeth of England. And the plot is to assassinate Elizabeth and assume the English throne and then re-Catholicize England. So Philip gives the plot his full backing. And one of the things that the plot is going to do is to bring England into war against the famed Spanish Armada. The Spanish had great navy or group of ships, the Armada. But on the day of the attack, the English Channel winds were definitely in the English favor. And the English defeat the Spanish badly in the war. But this war in those particular battles, the war between England and Spain will drag on for years. But the short answer to the long story is that Protestantism remains in England. Now let's shift to Calvinism, another spread of another different, similar Protestant idea, Protestantism to protest the church. Calvinism is the most important new form of Protestantism. Preceding the idea of God's absolute sovereignty and omnipotence, John Calvin concluded that human beings can't do anything to save themselves. This is different from Luther's thinking. And he says, God has already made this decision for you at the beginning of time of who will be saved and who will not be saved. And this is the idea of predestination. Calvin then is going to establish a city, government, and church in Switzerland, in Geneva, where he attempts to regulate people's conduct and make them closer to God. Everybody who comes to Geneva, he believes, is going to be predestined. And part of that is it's almost a small theocracy, if you will, within the governing of the city. And they ban card playing, dancing, and other forms of recreational activity. They will burn heretics at the stake, those who do not believe in their faith. The sources over on the right is John Calvin. So many of the source images of John Calvin are this very old, very long beard. And I was trying to look for something a little more contemporary when he was, doing his thinking and his writing, and it shows him in that at a desk there. One of his followers is a man named John Knox, who studies in Geneva with Calvin, and he will be instrumental in getting the Scottish Parliament to set up a Calvinist church as the official state church of Scotland, which later becomes more commonly known as Presbyterianism. So this is a very fast overview of spread of Protestant ideas. We didn't do anything with Eastern Europe, but just to layer in a bit of the learning that you should have already had earlier this year.
Great. So for the guided practice today, I wanted to kind of go back to something that we started last week on Thursday, and just sort of take a moment to remind everyone that when we're covering these topics, they are all very much related to one another. And when you're looking for things to talk about for contextualization or for background, remembering that these different concepts are interwoven is really important. So this is Erasmus, who Todd talked about on Thursday in the Northern Renaissance. He's a Christian humanist. And I want to just read to you this source, because another thing that you're looking for in this 5-document DBQ is going to be sources that corroborate one another and allow you to use them as evidence in a paragraph together to defend an argument. So this is his preface to his Greek translation of the Bible in 1516. And this is the year before Martin Luther writes posts that 95 Theses. So I vehemently dissent from those who would not have private persons read the Holy Scriptures, nor have them translated into vulgar tongues. Would that they were translated into all languages, so that not only Scotch and Irish, but Turks and Saracens, a medieval form for Arabs, might be able to read and know them. Would that the farmer might sing snatches of Scripture at his plow, and that the weaver might hum phrases of Scripture to the tune of his shuttle, that the traveler might lighten with stories from Scripture the weariness of his journey. So this is someone who, though critical of the church, absolutely distanced himself from Luther and chose to stay Catholic and to hang on to his Catholic faith. He disagreed on some theology with Luther, and we put him as our typical and iconic Christian humanist. So when we move on to the second document, and Todd, if you'll change the slide, this is Luther. And I didn't mention this when we were going over Luther and the 95 Theses, but after the Diet of Worms, one of the really important events that Luther does is to translate the Bible into German. And this is such a huge deal to allow the Bible to be accessible in the vernacular, the commonly spoken language. So here's Luther about his translation. In my translation of the Bible, I strove to use pure and intelligible German. Our quest for an expression could sometimes last 4 weeks without us being happy with our own work. In addition, I have not worked on my own. I have recruited assistants from everywhere. I tried to speak in German, not Greek nor Latin. But to speak German, one should not turn to texts in Latin. The housewife, children playing, people in the street are those to learn from. Listening to them teaches one to speak and to translate. Then they will understand you and know how to speak your language. So when we have these two sort of separate topics that we covered, I think it's really important to see the connection or the continuity in thought by these two people who end up in very different places, but are both criticizing the Catholic Church and both vehemently believe that the Bible needed to be accessible. And Martin Luther takes that next step. So there's this quote that's at the bottom: Erasmus laid the egg and Martin Luther hatched it. So I just want you to think, do you agree with this statement? And can you see the continuity between the ideas of the Renaissance in the North and the Reformation? And think if we were to get a Reformation DBQ, how nice that Northern Renaissance ideas might be to contextualize what's going to be happening in the Reformation when Luther starts it. So I just wanted to introduce you to some primary sources and have you think about the connection between the topics that we're covering, because sometimes that really gives you a good place to go for contextualizing what you're going to have to do, and which I'm having you do again for homework today.
Such a good activity. Thank you, Katie. So this is really well done. If you want to think more about that, again, you can pause this, you can rewind, you can also go back to it another day. But I really like this comparison of these two sources and making us think about that continuity between the two ideas. Give us an idea of what you think of that activity, that guided practice. Again, we're trying this to get some response from you via Twitter poll at Learning Euro, and we have another poll up there right now about this activity in today's guided practice. Just give us a little feedback. What did you think of that? Was it helpful to you? All right, we'll continue with our content, and we have to get into the wars of religion. Wow, this is just going to be so fast. Religious riots and civil war in France mark years of violence and civil war in France. It kind of begins with the 3 weak sons of Henry II. There's Francis II, who dies very young, Charles IX, who succeeds at the age of 10, but it's really his mother, Catherine de' Medici, who will be the regent. Then there's Henry III, who is intelligent, but rather incompetent as a king. So in C, French nobility takes advantage of this situation. They want religious reform through Calvinism. And when I say French nobility, I'm not talking about every noble, but there is a big chunk of nobles who are liking this idea of the Reformed faith. So number one, religious reform is especially important to lower classes, and riots and acts of violence surround the reformers and those trying to keep Catholicism as the authority. So we see the tension rising, and then the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre occurs, August 24th, 1572, a savage Catholic attack on Calvinists in Paris. This event, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, will lead to what is known as the War of the Three Henrys, a civil war in France where we have three Henrys vying to become king. There's the Catholic King Henry of Guise, there's the Protestant Henry of Navarre, and then there's the current Catholic king, who is Henry III, the one we have mentioned up here, who is intelligent but incompetent. Ultimately, what happens is the Politiques, Henry of Navarre, will come out the winner, if you will. The Politiques are a small group who believe that only a strong monarch can save France from total collapse. And Henry of Navarre, as we know, is Protestant, but with the death of Catherine de' Medici and assassinations of Henry of Guise and Henry III, then that leaves us only one Henry, Henry of Navarre, a politique, who will take the name Henry IV and who will also become Catholic. He will convert, saying the famous words of Paris is worth a mass. Next, in the first half of the 17th century, there's a fragile balance that turns out to be our 30 Years' War. We have the Peace of Augsburg, 1555, this uneasy truce between Catholics and Protestants, but it starts to deteriorate as the various areas shift about their ideas and their faiths. So we have 4 phases: the Bohemian phase, which is won by the Catholics; the Danish phase, led by King Christian IV of Denmark, but that again is won by the Catholics. And then in D, we have the Swedish phase, and the Swedish King Gustavus Adolphus comes and wins battles, although he is fatally wounded in the Battle of Lutzen. But it ends kind of Habsburg ambition of uniting all the German states under imperial authority. Then there is the French international, or sometimes known as the international phase. And what I always tell my students to remember is we know that France is very Catholic, but why would they help the Protestant side? And that is because they are always going to oppose Habsburg rule, because the last thing they want on their border is a very large, united nation-like Habsburg country, which could become Germany. So they're going to oppose Habsburg rule, and Cardinal Richelieu will declare war on Spain, and he will, not directly, but indirectly support the Protestant side. We have then, how does it end? With the Peace of Westphalia is the treaty that ends the 30 Years' War. It basically stipulates the Peace of Augsburg. German princes get their independent authority, and it just, in effect, it kind of destroys the Holy Roman Empire. The independence of the United Provinces of the Netherlands is then recognized. And the source, just real quick, is Gustavus Adolphus at the head of his troops before he is fatally battled at Lutzen. So very fast through the wars of religion for you.
I'm going to stop and say that I think that that's another date that is sort of a must know, is the Peace of Westphalia for 1648. I think students should have that on their sort of date list for important turning points in European history. So what happens because of this with the Catholic Church? There is a reaction. The Catholic Church is going to respond internally, and they're going to respond externally, opposing Protestants. The picture there that is actually in the city of Trent is the Council of Trent, the meetings that take place between 1545 and 1563 that are going to lay a basis for renewal and for reform. It will reaffirm a lot of the doctrine, but it does go ahead and reform or change a lot of the practices, and it'll address things like absenteeism and pluralism and the buying and selling of church offices, which is simony. New religious orders are founded. And I think the most important of these is the Jesuits, that is founded by Loyola. The Jesuits will be spreading the Catholic faith in different parts of the world, and they will be central to sort of reclaiming Southern Germany back for Catholicism. We also see the Order of Nuns that's going to be established that will look forward and see how they sort of protect Catholicism by teaching young women, and therefore sort of setting up future wives and mothers in the Catholic faith. There's already been an index of prohibited books, but it's certainly revved up with works by Erasmus and Protestants in general, Luther and Calvin, that will be prohibited, and the Inquisition will deal with dissent in a swift manner throughout all of the areas that are controlled by the Catholic Church. The other response is one we're going to talk about tomorrow, and that is Baroque art. So we'll get into that a bit tomorrow. That's sort of part of this pushback from the Catholic Church, and I'll show you some images of that in our lesson on Wednesday.
Great, thank you, Katie. One more time, we want some feedback. This was the content aspect of the lesson today. Respond to our Twitter poll at Learning Euro, and just tell us what you thought of the different pieces of content. We went very fast through Reformation, Wars of Religion, Protestant Ideas, and Catholic Reformation. Just give us some feedback. We'd appreciate it very much. Okay, our key takeaways today, we wanted to talk and bring you through the Reformation period, the Wars of Religion, Catholic Reformation, continuities and changes in the role of the church. We're still going to do a little bit of that coming up with Baroque art. It is important that we look at that. The sourcing and situation and contextualization was some of the skills we're working on today. Obviously, skill one, developments and processes, this thing leading to the next. And then causation and continuity over time, and continuity and change over time were the reasoning developments that we worked on.
All right, so I know we've done this a fair bit, but this is going to be the beginning of your DBQ, and I think you're really doing a great job, but this is something we can continue to practice, is to look at these skills of contextualization and thesis writing. So I would like you to do what some of you have already done before, is to start an introductory paragraph for a response that could be a response if documents followed, but could be a long essay. And that is, evaluate the most significant response to the Protestant Reformation. You should have a lot of nice review here to set up some really rich contextualization. And then I want to remind you, when you write your thesis statement, to make sure that you have a line of reasoning that explains why you are choosing that particular response. And as you have been doing, you can email these responses to apurovirtuallearning@gmail.com, and I will feature some of them at the beginning of our lesson tomorrow. But this is something, and if you're moving forward in other AP classes in history, every essay that you write on the AP exam is going to have this beginning part, this contextualization and thesis. So we're practicing it for our DBQ in May, and then hopefully moving forward if you're taking other AP history classes.
Just a quick note from College Board. We know that not all students have access to the internet or device. We're working on solutions to help students get what they need to show their best work. If you need mobile tools or connectivity or know someone who does, please reach out directly to College Board at cb.org/tech. Hey, and one more thing we want to start doing is we want to shout out to a lot of schools that keep sending us responses. This first shout out is going to go to Sheehan High School in Wallingford, Connecticut. I looked you guys up. You're the Titans. Go Titans. You got this. So we're going to start doing that every day. We want to make sure we give a shout out to all the different schools, as many as we can. And you're getting shout outs as well in some of your responses. But thank you guys for listening and paying attention. And we really believe that the work that we're doing together, we can help you with this. Okay. All right, Katie.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for watching. We appreciate it very much. Thank you. See ya.
Great week. Take care.